G'day, I am Dr. Olivia Bomester, and I will be presenting on the following topic: the role of personal boundaries in psychological well being. Key aspects that I will be highlighting in this presentation would be definitions and the importance of boundaries. I will also be speaking about some psychological theories, types, and levels of boundaries. And then I'm going to be briefly talking about the impacts on mental health. Importantly, I'm going to be highlighting how to set and enforce boundaries. And finally, I will be wrapping up the presentation by speaking about the costs of avoidances of setting boundaries. Let's begin. The term boundaries is frequently employed in a lot of our conversation, yet it is not often fully understood. So, boundaries essentially refer to the rules of engagement according to the Mayo Clinic. If we go a little bit further, we will find that the American Psychological Association delineates a boundary as a psychological demarcation that protects the integrity of an individual or group, or that helps a person or group set realistic limitations on participation in a relationship or an activity. Another scholar, Moore, says that boundaries refer to standards one establishes to safeguard your own well being by determining what one will accept and what one will not tolerate. So, people need limits in their lives to safeguard their mental health and also their emotional health, which essentially are components of their psychological well being. Now, you may ask the question, why do boundaries matter? Boundaries are critical for mental and emotional health. The functions of boundaries include preventing overextension of yourself, defining what is acceptable behavior. So, boundaries promotes clarity in relationships. Lisa Turkus has written a book entitled Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, and she mentions that health cannot bond with unhealth. Furthermore, Turkus mentions that where there is an abundance of chaos, there is usually a lack of good boundaries. She also mentions that chaos is likely to emerge across various aspects of your life if you do not have important boundaries established. And so it can spill over into family relationships, workplace dynamics, romantic relationships, and it can even cause problems in friendships if we do not have healthy, clear boundaries established. So, the statement of the problem in my paper is as follows. In an era of constant social, technological, and cultural shifts, maintaining personal boundaries is essential for preserving identity and stability. And we all know that poor boundaries contributes to emotional strain and compromised well-being. In my academic paper, I have highlighted the following rationale for the theoretical review. I have found that there's actually limited scholarly work done on this particular topic, the topic of personal boundaries and its relation to psychological well being. And so on the screen, you will be able to see the focus areas that I have highlighted in my journal article. In terms of the theoretical framework, so my particular study was guided by three particular psychological theories: attachment theory, self-determination theory, and cognitive behavioral theory. And I am going to be briefly speaking about each of these. So when it comes to attachment theory and boundaries, a lot of us know that secure attachment fosters autonomy and healthy boundaries in relationship. On the other hand, we have insecure attachment that can actually lead to rigid or porous boundaries, and it can cause a lot of emotional distress in relationships. Let's move on to the self-determination theory and talk about its relation to boundaries. So, self determination theory emphasizes autonomy, competence, and also relatedness within human relationships. Healthy boundaries protects autonomy and it fosters well-being according to this particular theory. When it comes to cognitive behavioral theory, CBT highlights how thoughts shape emotions as well as your behavior. And so sometimes we can have certain individuals adopting maladaptive beliefs. For example, I must say yes all of the time. And this kind of cognitive distortions can actually lead to poor boundaries and it can actually cause individual stress and also put a lot of strain in relationships. So I would like to highlight types of boundaries, which I have researched about in my particular journal article. And according to scholarly research, these are the following types of boundaries. We have physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, mental boundaries, as well as time boundaries. So let me give you a little bit more depth in terms of these types of boundaries. So when it comes to physical boundaries, what is important to note over here is that this has to do then with your personal space. And also it has to do then with the nature of physical contact that you allow between yourself and other individuals. So upholding these kinds of boundaries would be vital for your own comforts and safety in different settings. One particular scholar, Lee, argues that individuals are entitled to bodily autonomy and preferences. Another type of boundary would be your emotional boundary. Emotional boundaries serve to safeguard your feelings and emotional well being. They empower you to determine the extent of emotional investments which you wish to make in others. And this helps prevents emotional exhaustion on yourself. Then we also have our mental boundaries. And these mental boundaries speak about which kinds of ideas, beliefs, etc., you are willing to engage and recognize. So sometimes it is important then for you to actually take a mental pause when you are being flooded with too much information that can become overwhelming, and you can decide for yourself what you allow cognitively and what you do not wish to engage with. Interestingly, we also have time boundaries. Establishing time boundaries is key to achieving a healthy work-life balance, enabling you to dedicate time to relaxation, hobbies, and personal connections. Effective time management is vital for preventing burnout, according to many scholars. Now, boundaries also exist on a boundaries spectrum. So we have the different types of boundaries, the four which I have highlighted, and those four boundaries can fall into these categorizations. So they can either be porous boundaries or they can be rigid boundaries. And essentially, we should be aiming to be having healthy boundaries in our relationships. So let's have a look then at the different levels of boundaries in much more depth. And as we can see in terms of the information on the screen, porous and rigid boundaries are not healthy boundaries on the boundary spectrum. What we should be focusing our attention on would be to try to establish healthy boundaries, healthy time boundaries, healthy physical boundaries, healthy mental boundaries. That would be very, very important. So when we think then about porous boundaries are weak and poorly expressed limitations and unintentionally harmful. So they lead you to feeling depleted, overextending yourself, depression, anxiety, and unhealthy relationship dynamics. People with porous boundaries tend to sacrifice their own needs to make other people happy. People with porous boundaries also end up feeling overwhelmed and burnt out in an attempt to please everyone. These individuals who have lax boundaries oftentimes struggle to say no and may have trouble speaking up for their wants, their desires, etc., primarily because they don't wish to disappoint other people. So, porous boundaries can actually manifest in the following ways: oversharing, codependency, enmeshment, inability to say no, people pleasing, dependency on feedback from others, and also accepting maltreatment from others. So, porous boundaries are not good at all. And then on the other hand, we have our rigid boundaries. And so with rigid boundaries involve building walls to keep other people out as a way of keeping oneself safe. So it is actually interesting to note that whereas porous boundaries lead to unhealthy closeness, which is known then as enmeshment, rigid boundaries are a self-protective mechanism meant to actually build distance between you and other individuals. So this type of boundary comes from a fear of vulnerability or a history of being taken advantage of. Rigid boundaries manifest in never sharing, building walls between yourself and other individuals, cutting people out, and also having very high expectations of others and also enforcing strict rules. So, this is also a very interesting way in which some people live according to rigid boundaries. So, what we should be focusing our attention on would be trying to establish healthy boundaries in our lives. So, health boundaries manifest through being very, very clear in terms of our values, sharing with others appropriately in very healthy, respective ways, right? And you share that with individuals who have earned your trust. You also need to be able to be comfortable saying no, being comfortable also hearing the word no without taking offense, and also, when it comes to your healthy boundaries, they require much effort to establish as well as to maintain. One particular scholar, Huckabee, argues that healthy boundaries involve personal commitments, not demands, and enforcing boundaries means acting on them rather than solely stating them or articulating them. So, establishing boundaries as a pathway to psychological well being. According to the research, we will find that this would be highlighted if we are integrating boundaries in our own lives. Our stress levels will be greatly reduced. We'll have improved emotional regulation, enhanced self esteem, and better interpersonal relationships. So, in terms of stress reduction, if we establish good relationships in terms of our setting boundaries within those relationships, we avoid overcommitments and emotional exhaustion. We are able to clearly express our limits. We don't suffer from role overload and burnouts. Research shows that those with stronger boundary setting skills experience lower levels of chronic stress, particularly in high pressured environments. By curtailing unwanted obligations and creating psychological space for recovery, boundaries serve as a protective measure against the negative effects of stress. Let's move on to emotional regulation. When boundaries are respected, individuals can better manage emotional triggers and avoid overwhelming interpersonal situations. Research also indicates that individuals with well defined boundaries demonstrate greater emotional clarity, reduced emotional reactivity, and improved capacity to utilize adaptive coping strategies. We also find that having good boundaries helps you in terms of your positive sense of self-worth. When people articulate their needs and protect their emotional and physical space, they emphasize the internal belief that their feelings, values, and overall well-being hold significance. Ongoing experiences of affirming boundaries can boost self-confidence and reduce tendencies toward people-pleasing or self-neglect. In terms of relationships, we find that your interpersonal relationships can also improve and become enhanced. You are now clearly defining your boundaries, and so communication should improve. You should have less conflicts in terms of interpersonal conflicts. right? When individuals are able to assert their limitations while respecting boundaries of others, it cultivates a culture of relational trust and emotional safety. Research suggests that the practice of establishing boundaries encourages healthier attachment styles and lessens codependency in both intimate and family relationships. And this ultimately enhances your psychological well being. So, on the screen, we have some costs of avoiding boundaries, and this could include stress, burnout, insomnia, anxiety, depression, feelings of low self worth, and also having a lot of dysfunction or chaos in your interpersonal relationships. So, how do you set and enforce boundaries? Step one, it is essential that you identify the desired boundary, whether it be physical, mental, emotional, or time. Step two is very, very critical. Here, you need to communicate your needs. So, people cannot accurately assume one's boundaries based on body language or unspoken expectation. When you explicitly state what you expect, there is little room for other people to misinterpret what works for you. And so you need to make assertive yet respectful statements. And this is the best way to communicate or convey a boundary. And when you are communicating your boundary, be assertive and be direct, be respectful. So it is also very, very important to remember to make use then of I statements. I statements can be very beneficial as these do not automatically make the other person feel defensive. And then step number three would be important because over here you need to follow up then with action. So it's not just important then just to identify the boundary or communicate your boundary, but you also need to follow up then with action. Follow through is then very, very important. So, reactions to boundaries. So, not everybody is going to be appreciating when you clearly articulate and enforce your boundaries. So, there can sometimes be common negative reactions, which could include pushback, limit testing, ignoring, rationalizing, questioning, defensiveness. Some people can even ghost you. Some people can engage them in silent treatments. And each of these behaviors signifies a form of resistance, disrespect, or avoidance of the established boundary. Such responses can undermine trust and it can also cause interpersonal emotional distress in relationships. So, conversely, acceptance of these boundaries represents the most constructive response to when another person conveys his or her boundary. So, in terms of wrapping up this entire theoretical review, I want to highlight that healthy boundaries encourage autonomy, facilitate emotional regulation, safeguard against burnouts, and nurture more secure interpersonal connections. When boundaries are honored, individuals enjoy enhanced clarity, resilience, and overall life satisfaction. Inadequately established or breached boundaries can result in adverse effects such as chronic stress, emotional instability, diminished self worth, and also dysfunctional relationships. So, in my particular paper, I have demonstrated that while healthy boundaries contribute to psychological well being, their absence frequently leads to emotional turmoil, enmeshments, or social isolation. The societal and technological pressures of modern day life further complicate the process of boundary setting, underscoring the necessity for individuals to cultivate self awareness and assertiveness in addressing their needs. So it is important to delineate acceptable behavior. This will ultimately empower individuals so that they can flourish in terms of the interpersonal relationships and they can also flourish within themselves. Therefore, fostering boundary literacy should be a priority in psychological education, therapeutic psychological practices, and broader mental health discussion. For more information, you are most welcome to be referred to my journal article on the following topic: the role of personal boundaries in psychological well-being, a theoretical review where you would be able to get more in-depth information pertaining to the topic. Thank you so much for your attention and have a good day further.